Oh, perfect, yeah. Hello, everybody. Sorry, a bit late starting. People have been tied up in various meetings and things. So welcome back if you joined, if you were here, at the first session. And welcome if you are joining us for this one specifically. My name is Noelle, Noelle Kumpel. I'm Head of Policy at BirdLife International. And so together with Conservation International, we're running this whole day of different sessions looking at reimagining conservation and human rights. You've probably seen the variety of sessions. We have 6 sort of substantive sessions, and then we're wrapping up at the end of the day. So do please come and join us for as many as you can, where we're looking at different areas of this topic in celebration of International Human Rights Day, which is today. Some of you may be marching on the streets as well. We're also hoping to march for People and Planet at the same time. So it's a busy day. So we talked in the first session about the kind of broader concept and some of the sort of challenges in aligning and doing better in terms of integrating conservation and human rights. This session, we're going to focus down a bit on the specifics on how to integrate human rights, human-rights-based approach, and specifically also going to talk about the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment, and how we get those elements into the Global Biodiversity Framework, and why that's important to do so. So I'm here, we're going to start off firstly with Helen Tughendhat from the Forest Peoples Programme. So she is going to talk to us about the position and so some of these areas and why it's important, but also talk us through the position that a group of us have put together. We're part of the informal sort of CBD-focused Human Rights and Biodiversity Working Group. So if we have a position here on all these aspects, so please come and collect a copy or ask us for an online version if you'd like. So we're going to run through that and then have some reflections from members of the group from different constituencies on what is important for them and to drill down into the detail a bit in terms of the different elements of the framework. So firstly to Helen then, if you, to take us through the sort of overarching concepts and positions here. Thanks, Helen.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here and to be able to share some of the thoughts that have come out of the Human Rights and Biodiversity Working Group. Before I start, I just wanted to acknowledge that we're gathered and we're meeting here today on the unceded territory of the Kahnawake Mohawk community. I've been invited today to talk about some of the work that's been done by this informal group. And I wanted to just give a tiny bit of background about that group. So it's a group that's been working together since 2021. So since pre-pandemic days, we met physically. And the reason that we came together is that we were all concerned from very different backgrounds. It's a very diverse group. We were all concerned that the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was then in its 0 draft form, did not have the links to human rights that we felt that it was going to need if it was going to be successful. And it wasn't just us. So we noticed through 2021 that the UN Human Rights Framework, the UN Human Rights bodies started making public statements and comments specifically about the relationship between human rights and the environment in a way that they hadn't engaged as much previously. So we've had a special rapporteur on human rights and the environment for a while. It's now the second mandate holder in place now. But it was that first mandate holder that made a statement in January that for all of us really captured some of the concerns and the issues that were also within us. So I'd just like to read a very small excerpt from the statement that, that John Knox at the time put out in January 2021. The damaging fortress conservation model of the past, which has resulted in Indigenous peoples and local communities being evicted from their traditional territories to create protected areas, is completely incompatible with the international human rights obligations of states. And then he went on, working in partnership with Indigenous peoples and local communities has proven across the world to be an effective and equitable path forward, improving biodiversity protection, respecting human rights, and alleviating poverty at the same time. So these incredibly strong statements were starting to come out of the UN human rights framework and bodies, and we were hearing them, but we weren't necessarily seeing them being introduced into the environmental treaty side of the UN. And the Global Biodiversity Framework was obviously it was the biggest game in town in terms of redefining environmental treaties and environmental commitments. So we made a collective commitment, I think probably at the beginning, between about 30 or 40 organizations, to track this collectively and to bring our sort of collective weight to the analysis. By the time we got to September of the same year, the Human Rights Council was also passing resolutions about human rights in the environment that had equally strong language. And the resolution makes the same 2 points that the Special Rapporteur made. One, that bad environmental policy can violate human rights, but also the flip side, that the promotion and support of particular kinds of human rights can enable and support positive environmental and conservation outcomes. So the dichotomy or the relationship between human rights and environmental law goes in both directions. And it was that sort of both directions piece that we were most interested in. And that's reflected a little bit in the makeup of the group. So the group includes representatives from all of the major constituency, not all, most of the major constituency caucuses to the Convention on Biological Diversity. The International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity is represented in the group. The Youth Caucus is represented in the group. The Women's Caucus also participates in the group. And so we come at this from a range of different angles. We have large conservation organizations also represented in the group. And we have a lot of my sort of organisation, which is like a technical support NGO sort of organisation. And we all collectively started to look at the zero draft and to come up with proposals and thoughts about what we felt the GBF should be doing. So if we fast forward from there, we've participated in each of the major negotiation points, each of the open-ended working group meetings. We've held side events, we've held webinars, we've done briefings for state parties, and now we come here to the final draft, to the draft that's being negotiated right now. And I just wanted to share 3 observations or thoughts about how we have assessed the current draft text as it emerged from open-ended working group 5. So that's 2 days ago, maybe 3 days ago, maybe 4 days ago. So the first point that I wanted to make is that applying a human rights-based approach to this framework has been introduced into the text. Ever since the co-chair's reflection document, there has been a BBIS, a section at the beginning, a guidance section, which talks about the importance of a human rights-based approach. It talks about the importance of a right to a clean, healthy, sustainable environment. It talks about the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And that addition, which is still called BBIS, and is currently being negotiated, is a really crucial element of the framework. So having that in place is a good thing. So I wanted to say that first, because there's some debates about how to think about BBIS. BBIS is a good thing. To have a framework without an introductory framework that references human rights law like that would be a weaker framework. But there's something, and this moves to my second point, there's something that has to sit alongside BBIS, and that is BBIS is not a monitored operational part of the framework. It's not simply preambular, but it won't be reported on, and it won't be operational in the same way as the goals and targets of the frameworks. So it only works to have a BBIS that talks about international human rights law if you link human rights into the targets and the goals where they are most relevant. So that's the second point I wanted to talk about a little bit. There are 2 ways in which human rights need to be incorporated into the goals and targets. The first one is where these rights enable the realization of the target. And an example of this would be Target 3. There is no way to achieve Target 3 without recognizing and protecting and promoting some of the territorial rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So that's a human right, a territorial right of Indigenous peoples, which enables the realization of a target. It's not the only target that is realized through human rights, but it's certainly one that's getting probably the most attention. The other way in which human rights come into the target is where particular human rights need to be protected in the context of the target. And one that is probably quite a good example of this is Target 5, which deals with the use of wild species. Now, if we're dealing with the regulation or control in the use of wild species, then we are talking about actions that will bump up against customary sustainable use. And if there is going to be global commitments to reduce harvesting of wild species, then we need to be protecting certain uses of wild species within that target. So that's the second way in which rights need to come into goals and targets. I'm just going to say out loud the list of our priority targets, because I've given you 2 examples, but there's many more. So the priority targets for us are 1, 2, and 3, the area-based conservation, the area-based targets. 5 and 9, both of 5 dealing with customary sustainable use, 9 with agroecology and the promotion of small-scale access to resources, 15, which is a really important target on the responsibilities of business. And just for those who don't read these documents in quite the level of detail that I seem to spend my life doing, Target 15 is the only target that has human rights mentioned in the monitoring framework. The only one. So Target 15 is a really important target to defend in terms of what are the responsibilities of business to consider human rights or apply a human rights-based approach in their delivery in the regulation of business under this convention. And then targets 20, 21 and 22, which are the targets on traditional knowledge. That's 20, which can only be accessed with free, prior and informed consent. 21, which is an incredibly important target, which confirms the right to full and effective participation by Indigenous peoples and local communities, by women and girls, by youth, by environmental defenders. And it even has language in it that commits governments to securing access to justice. We've never had access to justice language in an environmental agreement before. And that's a really, really big deal. And even bigger, that target doesn't have any brackets in it. It's one of the few targets that made it through the open-ended working group, popped out the other side and is clean. When it goes to COP, the expectation is it will go through. And Yves is pointing out that it may not. It is still possible for it to be stopped. But Target 21 I think is a really big deal, and it becomes a bigger deal if we talk about it more. And the other thing that I would say very quickly about the relationship between Target 21 and the rest of the framework is Target 21 underpins the other targets. So we need to be looking at the commitment to participation in Target 21 as being directly linked to Target 3, 4, 5 and all the rest when they're implemented. And then, of course, Target 22, which is the women's rights target, which I won't say too much about because I know we're going to have other reflections on that one. So then, have I got enough time to say? Yeah. So the third point that I wanted to make, hoping I'm not going too far over time, is we've spoken about the importance of BBiz and the importance of bringing human rights into specific targets. The third key area where it's really important to be thinking about human rights now is the monitoring framework. So the thing that gives the framework teeth between now and 2030 is what we're asking governments to report against. And that is whatever is in the monitoring framework. And the monitoring framework won't be finalised at COP15. It's impossible. There's too much on this agenda for that to happen. It is possible that the headline indicators are adopted, but there will be an ongoing process of developing more indicators over probably between COP15 and COP16. Some of what I'm saying is probably, because this depends on the decisions that are taken in this COP. And one of the things that the Human Rights and Biodiversity Working Group has been spending a lot of time on is how do you monitor human rights compliance effectively in an environmental treaty? And Noelle has been doing, in particular, a lot of work on this in the context of Goal B, because there is monitoring of the goals. And if we get human rights text into Goal B, then we have human rights in the monitoring of Goal B. I won't go into any more detail on what the sort of text suggestions on that might be, but that's the sort of third point that I wanted to make. And then the very last thing on the monitoring framework is the decision here will set up a technical expert group, which will work on those indicators between now and the next COP. That technical expert group needs diverse voices on it. It needs to have Indigenous peoples representatives, it needs to have community representatives, it needs women, it needs youth, because if those voices aren't there, then the indicators that emerge won't be relevant for those groups. In the last expert meeting, out of 40 participants, 3 represented, 1 represented women and 2 from Indigenous peoples and communities. So we want to see that expand. We want to see youth and we want to see more representatives in. That's the final comment that I wanted to make, so I might close there. If anybody wants to know more about what I've been talking about, we do have copies of, this is the short briefing that came out from the working group that I've been talking about. Everyone's welcome to grab a copy. If you'd prefer digital, we have a lot more of those. Thanks very much.
Excellent, Helen. Thank you so much. Welcome. Brilliant. That was a really fantastic overview of what the human rights and why the Human Rights and Biodiversity Working Group exists. Big step forward. We were talking earlier in the session before about partnerships, and I mentioned the group and how brilliant it has been working on this. And into the technical detail on the indicators, we've got another little group going on that one. So this is, yeah, really a step forward to be working closely together on these issues and understanding them. So yeah, it's the start of a process as well, I hope, getting this into the Global Biodiversity Framework and then working to actually make this happen in terms of the implementation side. So it's been really, really good for me personally and for BirdLife to be part of that group. So stay here, Helen, and then the next, I'm going to welcome a few more people to come up to the panel, other members of the group, to give us some perspectives. I think we don't have Josefa from Youth, who I know she's very stretched and she's sort of busy on negotiations and things, so she may be able to join us, but maybe not. But we have Jennifer Corpuz here, who's representing the Indigenous, the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, from Tero as well. Yves, do you want to come up? And Yves Landor from Earth Justice, and I think also Tina and women also held up. Everyone's quite stretched at the moment, so we can cover some of those elements. I mean, here Helen is a woman, and so is Jennifer. But yeah, so if they may be able to join us, but if not, we'll cover sort of different areas. We are all working very closely together. So we just now wanted to kind of touch on a few of, Helen's already sort of introduced various areas within the Global Biodiversity Framework where we need to incorporate these human rights elements. We talked in the session before as well that this is a step change from the current strategic plan having any human rights in there, and it was interesting you mentioned just Target 15, mentioning human rights. We were at a side event run by business, and the business concerned was calling in Target 15 to have mandatory due diligence of human rights and biodiversity reporting. So both those elements are very poorly reported upon by businesses. They're kind of the tricky bits. You get environmental reporting, but you don't drill down to biodiversity. And yeah, at the same time, we need to get human rights reported on there as well. So good to hear it's also coming from the business community as well. And the business of, so I think everyone's coming together to sort of realise we need to do better here. So anyway, moving on to my colleagues here. Do you want to go? Well, actually, okay, we're going to start. We're going to kind of sort of start at the top. That's why I put Yves first. If you want to talk a bit more about Goal B, if we start there, and we talked about access to justice and those sorts of issues, and then we'll go down. Not a hierarchical process, but we'll work down the framework. Put it that way. Oh, fantastic.
Okay. Well, thank you very much first for organizing this event and for having me with you. It's quite a pleasure to be here of celebrating the Human Rights Day at the Nature Positive Pavilion. It is really a first. And I think a few years ago we would not have thought that possible and not even envisaged it. So I'd just like to underline what an achievement it is to have such a celebration here in such a pavilion. And this is due to a process over the last years of joint campaigning and joint work. And if we think about precisely the references, as you were saying, and thank you, Helen, for your brilliant presentation, because you don't only have mentions of human rights, but also a number of mentions of the right to a healthy and sustainable environment. And this is an achievement also of a big campaign where all our organizations, human rights organizations, indigenous peoples organizations, and environmental and conservative organizations have joined forces and worked together over the last years in order to have this result of the adoption first at the Human Rights Council of the recognition of the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. And then afterward, this decision of the Human Rights Council that was adopted in October, the 8th of October 2021, then was confirmed last July by the United Nations General Assembly. It's a very short text, actually, just recognizing the fact that the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment exists. It doesn't say much more because you do have, and basically it's an acknowledging the state of the art. You do have this recognition at the national level, very often in constitutions or in the legal frameworks, with, of course, different definitions. You know, you might have slight differences in that. And you also have it recognized at the regional level by the human rights regional systems like the European Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American Commission and Courts on Human Rights, and also the African Peoples and Human Rights Court, and also Commission and Court. So in these three systems, you also have this recognition. So it's really something which is very important that finally this is recognized at the universal level. And of course, it implies that you have to acknowledge that you have this diversity of approaches. So what is interesting in this is in the process, and is this what we've been achieved as a joint force between the human rights and the environmental organization has also then triggered some work directly for the CBD. And that's where, in addition to what has just been presented by the working group, which was quite an achievement, on our side, for the Geneva-based organizations, when we saw that the CBD in the preparation of this COP was stopping in Geneva, we decided that we have to do something to make sure that the stop in Geneva is as productive as possible, particularly in the field of human rights, where you have the human rights body. The Council works in Geneva, the Office of the High Commissioner, we just heard Ben at the previous speech, they are also based in Geneva. So, and most of the permanent missions in Geneva are actually the place where the human rights experts of the Foreign Affairs Ministry are represented. So it was really a good opportunity to make sure that these connections are made. And what is quite interesting is that actually in the field of climate change, in the preparation of the Paris Agreement, there was also a similar process when the issues of human rights were started to be included in the negotiation when they stopped in their meeting in Geneva. So we tried to do the same, and we have here, and that's what I'm representing here with Alex at the back from Soka Gakkai. We are members of the working group, of the task force on human rights and biodiversity, which is operating from Geneva, and will continue to support the work afterwards in Geneva. And so what is interesting to see is, as you said, you have these different references now in BBIS, in the preamble parts, and we think now this is something which is okay, because it's also now since yesterday without brackets, and there was a very interesting discussion among a small group of states to finally get to this result, because before it was really not clear, and now we have these elements where you have the recognition of the linkages with human rights and with the right to a healthy and sustainable environment. What is interesting is that it shows that the reflection in the field of human rights has progressed over the last years, and it's very important that this is reflected in the Global Biodiversity Framework, because over the time, it's not just individual rights, very specifically, that have to be identified. And when I mean individual, I want to mean specific rights, which have to be identified. But you also have a global approach to how do you deal with these rights in the field of environment. And it's very important that this element is reflected in the biodiversity framework and precisely in the preamble part. Now, what is also interesting is that this right to a healthy and sustainable environment is also what was in the language before for goal B. Now, right now, it's moved down to a footnote, and we hope that in the coming days, we're going to come back to this footnote. A number of parties have asked that we come back to discuss this footnote, because as it was very clearly said by Helen, and I won't repeat that, we need this operational part. So here, the right to a healthy and sustainable environment is providing this link. And in a way, it's great that we have this very global approach. It's a bit of a coincidence, because it could have been formulated differently. That's how, the negotiation goes. But we do hope that this will come back in order to have this operational part, because this will link with all the work which is done on the monitoring framework. Just a final element on the targets. As Helen said, Target 21, which is really focusing on indigenous people and local communities, women, youth, and environmental defenders. This is an extremely important element. We had a number of already here in this building, a number of events where environmental defenders were able to witness and say what they are going through, what they have to live in order to defend and protect the environment. A number of them are threatened. We had the march yesterday in memory of those who have disappeared as environmental defenders. So it's a very important element, and it's very important that it is in a target, because that means that it will help to do the follow-up on these elements. And so I'll finish on saying also that what is really important in this process is that the Global Biodiversity Framework, and also with all the reporting mechanism that we hope will come with it, including the question of the indicators, is now fitting, and I hope will fit, because it depends on the outcome, but will come into a more global framework where the parties have to report on what they are doing in terms of environment and human rights, generally speaking. You have also similar type of reporting with the NDCs in the climate change process. You have also the global stocktake. And we know that you have a number of links here in terms of biodiversity and climate change, but also the human rights issues, and they're very often connected. So basically, it's three elements that have to be taken together. We're only at the very beginning of that, but that's a work that will need to be done on both sides. And then you also have the different reporting mechanisms within the Human Rights Council, starting with what is called the Universal Periodic Review, where states are reviewing their, what they are doing, their performance in terms of human rights. Here now we have to bring in the environmental aspects, climate change, biodiversity, and so on. So this is another element where we can bring these different evaluations. And of course you have the work which is done by the special rapporteurs, which are the individual people doing the inquiries for the Human Rights Council on a number of issues. And we will have next week, we'll have the privilege to have here in COP15, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, Professor David Boyd. So for all those who will have the possibility to attend some of his events or to meet with him, it will be an interesting moment to discuss also how in the field of human rights we will be able now to report back on how we're dealing with this question of the right to a healthy and sustainable environment and biodiversity. So this is just to say we are right now in this process of trying to get to a good outcome. But we can see already now today, and that's a positive aspect, that we see a number of handles we will be able to use in the coming years in order to make sure that there is a follow-up and that there is a concrete actions with the different rights that we are now putting into these documents. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yves. Yeah, that's an excellent review. Overview from the sort of human rights perspective and bringing those two worlds together. Yeah, just to flag that yesterday was International Human Rights Defenders Day, and today is Human Rights Day. So yeah, really key pair of days there. And David, yeah, we had a video of David in our opening session, and he's spoken already in a couple of sessions that we've had. So we're really looking forward to him being here in person as from tomorrow. Unfortunately, missing most of the events we seem to have organised this week. But yeah, a great opportunity for him and to talk directly to some of the parties as well. I think that'd be really helpful. So over now to Josefa Corpuz, who is going to talk to us. If you talk us through some of the elements related to the Indigenous community, particularly. Thank you.
Thanks, Noelle. Yes, so I've been invited to talk about the Indigenous people's rights elements within the framework, but I wanted to begin by saying in order to be truly nature positive, we don't just count the biodiversity, we have to be indigenous people's rights positive as well, because we cannot work to achieve the targets, but in the process violate the rights of those who have been stewarding and guarding nature. So, within the framework, there are many indigenous rights references, and I'll go through the text with you and end with a call for one of the most pressing concerns that we have now in the negotiations. I'll start from top to bottom because that's what the contact group has been doing. And in paragraph 9 of the framework, which is BBIS, I don't know if you talked about it, but BBIS is the overarching sort of guiding principle and guidance for implementation in relation to indigenous peoples. And it contains full and effective participation, free, prior, and informed consent. We were hoping to have respect for land rights there, but it was deleted. We have including traditional knowledge and the necessity for having FPIC. As well as the basis for all this, which is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, international human rights law, and others. Okay, so that's it. These are principles. These are not just considerations. So we feel like that they have to get the chapeau, the title of the section right. We have to be clear. These are principles and guidance for implementation, not just mere considerations. And then we go to the actual targets. No? We've been under constant pressure to limit mentions of indigenous rights to certain parts of the text, which is the overarching, the preamble, the overarching principles. However, because of the situation that we are in, wherein many approaches to protect and conserve biodiversity have ended up displacing indigenous peoples, putting them in jail for uses of wild species that are customary, governed by customary law, and so forth. Our demand has always been that it's important for key targets to very clearly reflect indigenous peoples. Why? Because in Aichi, we already had a target 18 that was supposed to be implemented in a cross-cutting way. But we look at the national reports, the GBO, it was never implemented in a cross-cutting way. Therefore, we think that the language itself needs to be mainstreamed in the most important targets. So which targets are these now? They are target 1 on spatial planning, target 3 on area-based conservation, or 30 by 30. And then we have the sustainable use targets, which is target 5 and target 9. We have the ABS target, access and benefit sharing, third objective of the convention, target 13. Finances, because a lot of the finances, they go to these very big organizations and very, very small amount trickles down to indigenous peoples. So finance. And then 20, which is the types of knowledge that would guide decision-making on biodiversity. And the last one, which is respect for traditional knowledge, participation, and land rights of indigenous peoples. So, okay, so what's the status? I'll go through it target by target. In target 1, we currently have unbracketed language on respecting, then in brackets, protecting the rights of indigenous peoples. And we hope that it can stay there without brackets, because when we do national spatial plans, sometimes indigenous peoples and their life plans, their sustainable development plans are invisible. No? So we cannot have a national plan that says, oh, we will devote this to conservation without being, without recognizing and being blind to the presence of indigenous peoples there, as well as their plans. Target 3 on area-based conservation. Maybe I do not need to repeat to this audience that many indigenous peoples have been displaced because of fortress conservation, strictly protected areas, areas that are highly and fully protected. So this is a major concern for indigenous peoples. There is currently language on the rights of indigenous peoples there, unbracketed, and we are hoping that it remains that way until the end. But in addition, we believe that there has to be a diversity of options for recognition of areas that are protected, that are delivering good biodiversity outcomes. So it's not just in protected areas, it's not just OECMs, it's also indigenous territories which have been in existence for thousands of years. So I'll get back to that in the last part of the presentation. Okay, so we have targets 5 and 9. Target 5 is about reducing threats. So reducing threats and the threat there is overexploitation of wild species. We want there recognized that indigenous peoples have customary sustainable use. Okay? So it's currently in the text, and we hope it stays there. It doesn't get removed. Target 9 is about meeting people's needs, no? The contributions of nature to people. And again there, customary sustainable use, small farmers, indigenous farmers have contributed, and we want that recognized there. Otherwise, we have things about, making the industrial food systems more productive. So that's target 9. Then targets 20 and target 13, of course, there should be substantial benefits because we have had the ABS law for 12 years now, but not enough benefits has flowed to indigenous peoples. So we are supportive of the words substantial benefits in target 13. And then in target 20, it needs to be clear, that the basis for decision making is not just scientific evidence, it's also traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples, which should be accessed only with the free, prior, and informed consent. And last is that 21, which is the indigenous peoples specific target. So as I said earlier, it contains land rights, FPIC, as well as respect for traditional knowledge. Then I wanted to end because target 3 is going to be taken up now in the contact group tonight. And for us, it is very, very important to have in there indigenous people's territories and customary lands and waters. I explained earlier that scientific studies have shown that indigenous peoples are the best guardians of nature. So why do we need to fix what isn't broken? Why do we need to bring or to have indigenous territories declared as protected areas and OECMs if the indigenous peoples themselves do not want it to be declared as a PA or OECM? So we hope that this can be supported. It's going to be a big fight. And we hope that if you have any connections, if there are any government representatives here, please approach us for an explanation. We have compiled the basis for this proposal. It's all these words are existing in international human rights law. So we urge the parties to support us. Those who are non-parties, we hope you could also support us because it's going to be a very, very big discussion tonight. Thank you.
Fantastic, great. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Yeah, and lots of food for thought there too. Yeah, we should be having discussions. I think we could carry those on afterwards as well. We're going to have, we've got till 12:15. So I'm just going to, as Sefa is tied up, Helen is going to, and Tina, as a female, as a woman, is going to quickly cover target 22 as the gender-based target.
So this is just a quick addition to what I said before, and normally I don't speak about target 22 particularly much, but target 22 was a new target. It wasn't in the original zero draft, but it is now a secure part of the framework, so it was passed clean. It's a target that commits to a gender-responsive implementation of the framework, and it also commits to recognising the land and resource rights of women and girls. And because Target 22 is new, because it's only come into the framework relatively close to the end of the process, it hasn't had any indicators discussed for it yet. So there's some room and some flex in Target 22 between COP15 and COP16, which I think the Women's Caucus for Biodiversity will be stepping into that space very strongly. I'm sorry Tina's not here to talk about this herself, but every member of the Women's Caucus who is here is wearing a purple flower on their lapel. So if you would like to hear more about Target 22 from somebody who knows a lot more than me, anybody walking around with a purple and yellow flower will be able to give you a lot more information. The text of the target now is good, so it needs to be defended, and then we need to think about how we measure gender disaggregated data when reporting in. Thanks.
Oh, sorry. Oh, yes, sorry. Yeah, sleep. Yeah, thank you very much. That's to cover that. Actually, Josefa is hoping to join us, so I'll try and have a couple of minutes when Josefa comes down to join us with the youth perspective. But yeah, for now, could I open it out to the floor if anyone's got any questions? Has anyone got a microphone that we can run around with? Amy's disappeared. Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. Has anyone got any questions for anybody on anything we've covered? No? Oh. What was my reflection going to be? Oh, yeah. Well, okay, great. Brilliant.
Thank you. This is Sushil with the Wildlife Conservation Society. I appreciated everyone's presentations, in particular Yves talking about the human rights system. So in addition to special procedures, UPR, I would also suggest the treaty bodies as and when the reports come up, because those are legally binding treaties, and that's where delegations have very detailed discussions. So yet another venue to move forward. Thank you.
Yeah, no, yeah, thank you, yeah. Anyone else would like, yeah, exactly, reflections, your perspectives, questions? Very much want to hear any challenges to us as well. I could ask the usual question if we've got any parties in the room. This is a challenge as well, having an event at the same time as negotiations, I know. Well, I just wanted to reflect quickly as well on something that you mentioned about nature positive as well. And I should say, as being part of sort of the group that's thought about this nature positive concept for quite a while, and we had lots of discussions at the IUCN Congress where this kind of came to formation, and in fact some virtual dialogues while we were waiting for the Congress to actually happen physically. And yet it's conceptualized as part of an equitable, carbon neutral, nature positive world. So I think that we shouldn't forget those other elements, and particularly the equitable part. So we kind of thought the conversations we were having were about how those are very, very connected. So yeah, it's not just a nature positive drive, it's really about bringing those different areas together, which also we talked about, which Yves mentioned in terms of the kind of concrete framework parts. So yeah, Yves, you wanted to come back, I think. Oh, no, great. Oh, I'm saving the day. Brilliant. Here comes Josefa is here from youth. So, yeah, extremely busy covering a lot of areas. So, fantastic. As well timed. So, yeah, we can hand over to you for some youth reflections. So, we've been just talking. We've heard about the Human Rights and Biodiversity Working Group and our positioning. And, yeah, we've been talking through the framework and what elements are kind of key for people. So, yeah, over to you, Josefa.
Thanks so much. I'm sorry for joining late. So, we're really happy with some of the wins that we've had so far. During the working group, we managed to clean the text on a very important target for us, Target 21, which now, features the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, women and girls, as well as children and youth, to inclusive participation, to access to information, access to justice, and also on the full protection of environmental defenders. So we're really, really happy about that. We also managed to get some of our key principles into the text of BIBIS on intergenerational equity, on transformative, innovative, and multidisciplinary education, on a human rights-based approach, which we've been working on for a long time with our colleagues here, and also on the contributions of indigenous peoples and local communities. We're very, very happy about those things. We're still looking forward to a few things, like making sure that we have a strong goal B that is rights-based, that keeps in mind present and future generations, a strong also mechanisms to allow for direct and accessible access of resources for indigenous peoples and local communities and women and youth, because all of these resources never flow down to the ground where it's really needed. And also for rights-based approaches for businesses in Target 15. This is something we're really watching out for, and stronger business regulation. And yeah, so we're going to continue to be in the negotiations, follow all of these things very closely. And yeah, keep pushing and pushing since the beginning of this process 4 years ago. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Josefa. Yeah, I mean, incredibly busy and working around the clock. So thank you for making some time, because I know you're covering a lot of, quite a bit large part of the agenda. So yeah, we've just got a few minutes left. I mean, I could, if there are no other questions, if we just go around, if you're welcome everybody to give us, last minute closing thoughts. And Helen was going to touch on something as well, so on implementation. So yeah, so do you have any? Would you like to, Yves, Jennifer, have a closing thoughts? Jennifer. Okay. Yeah. Helen.
I know I gave mine away.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. I'll hand to you. So I just wanted to make one point just at the very end, which is we're all talking quite a lot on this panel about the negotiations because they're happening now, but there's only another week in them. And the big game here is implementing this thing when it comes out. So I don't want to distract from the importance of continuing to push on the things that aren't secure yet. And I think Target 3 and respecting and protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, as Jennifer's already mentioned, is a critical fight over the next week. So those fights are coming up, and people need to be talking to their governments, standing outside the room, applauding when governments say good things, talking to every government you can get your hands on to see what their position is. If they say the wrong thing in the room, talk to them afterwards and say, I don't think as a citizen of your country that's what you should be doing. That lobbying is still available to all of us, and we should be doing that. But the other thing that I think is really important for all of us to take away from this COP is we are going to have some hooks in this framework which are good. And they're the hooks that we can take back to our governments. And they're also the hooks that we can take to organisations that work on these issues. And that involves conservation organisations, but also lots of other organisations that work on restoration activities, that work on a range of things to do with environmental restoration and protection. And we can use this framework, the language in this framework, to say this is what governments have committed to, and these are the regulations that governments should be placing on you. So you can proactively step into that space and behave really strongly and well, and as partners with Indigenous peoples, partners with women, partners with young leaders from around the world. So I just want to sort of give a call to action for when this thing is finished. We can't forget that the GBF exists, because some of it will be really useful for us. Thanks.
Thank you. 2 points. One, I was presenting earlier on Target 3, and I realized maybe some people are thinking that, oh, she doesn't like protected areas. But what I wanted to say, actually, just to clarify our push for Indigenous territories to be in the text, is that what we need is the diversity of options. Okay? There are Indigenous peoples, most notably here in Canada, who have been part of the system. Indigenous protected and conserved areas are recognized. That's a good experience. In Australia, Indigenous protected areas are recognized, and that's good. And in places where the rights of Indigenous peoples are strongly recognized, I think that could work. There are Indigenous peoples also who would like to engage with other effective area-based conservation measures. But what I'm saying is that there are some, and we have here guests from the One Piece Nation, for example, in Peru, and they have declared by themselves an autonomous territory. Okay? So why not give those kinds of those types of governance and protection, another option for recognition as an effective conservation area? Maybe the second I wanted to say is this: only as good as the implementation. And when we talk about implementation, the indicators are important because these are what the countries will be chasing. So we have a headline indicator that we are proposing. It hasn't been accepted yet, or I'm not sure, maybe it hasn't. But security of tenure, customary tenure of Indigenous peoples over their lands. There are many, many studies that say that in places where tenure of Indigenous peoples is respected, the place is protected better. So that should be one of the headline indicators. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And after what you just said, Jennifer, it is clear that we will still have to see what will be the outcome of this COP15. And as Helen said, we still have 1 week of fight in front of us to make sure that what is good in the text remains in it, and that we do have the needed still improvements, like what is we are asking for in Goal B. But whatever the outcome will be, it is clear that the evaluation of COP15 will rely on two elements: the ambition in terms of the protection of biodiversity and the way that the fundamental rights for indigenous people, for women, for all of the different communities are also included. And the two things have to go together. And that's how we will be able to evaluate the success of COP15. And even if we're not that happy with some of the details of the text, I think what has been said now is that there is a number of hooks that we will be able to use in the future. So this is only just the beginning of a new phase of work in this field. And the fact that we're linking human rights and biodiversity gives us also more opportunities to make sure that there is a coherent approach also throughout the different international systems. So it is a fight which is just beginning after next week, and hopefully with a very good outcome in the next weekend.
And for me, well, one of our key campaigns as young people has been Stop the Same. I just want to really emphasize our point with this, because this is one of the key ways where the CBD can stop the same. It's just that for too long, really, like conservation, the biodiversity field has not taken seriously into account the historical injustices that have happened in relation to conservation. It has carried out its actions without, without actively considering doing no harm, leaving no one behind, these kinds of things. And that has really led to to many of conservation actions being ineffective and inequitable. And I think what people also forget is that because they're inequitable, they also become ineffective. So our call as youth is that even after this framework, is that we continue to be critical of business as usual, because business as usual is what got us here. And we need to just continue to push strongly for actions that stop the same greenwashing, the same injustice, the same greed that has brought us here. The post-2020 is just one avenue, and there are many, many avenues that we all take part in our daily lives. So let's use that, and happy Human Rights Day, I guess.
Thank you. That was a fabulous note on which to end. We're at time now, but exactly, and we talked about that in the first session, the links, the absolute need for this to be equitable in order to be effective. So that was a great ending there. Thank you, everybody. Up on the screen is the rest of the events for the day. So we have short breaks between each event, each session, and they're an hour each. So coming up next, we're going to really dig into the practice and the reality of human rights in conservation. So that's with the International Indigenous Peoples Forum. So that's great. Less of me, definitely good. And then we're looking at environmental defenders. Then we have a session. We talked about indicators. There's a whole session then coming up this afternoon, led by our colleague at Forest Peoples Programme, on how to measure the human rights and the right to healthy environment as well through the Global Biodiversity Framework. Then we've got one on finance. We had Sarah from Jeff earlier introducing that topic, but we talked about getting the resources onto the ground. So we've got a session on finance, and then we're going to have a wrap-up later on. So please do join us for all or any of those events throughout the day. And yeah, happy Human Rights Day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Just so folks know, there will be interpretation in this event. So if you, over here in the corner or on the side are the interpreters. So please leave your badge. Va a haber interpretación en el evento. So, por favor, anden a dejar sus credenciales. Yeah. Okay, if they let you out. If they let you out of here. They may not let you out of here. If they closed, yeah, the last night they didn't let people out. Just so that everyone knows, there will be interpretation for this event. You can walk over here to your right and get that. You need to leave your badge. Para que sepan, hay interpretación para el evento. Por favor, vayan a buscar los aparatos y dejen sus credenciales. We will also have it in French, however, my French is not that great, so. One more call, there is interpretation, so please go to your right and get interpretation equipment over in the corner there. Thank you. Pasang, Francisco. Hola, hola. Pasang is the Pasang, Francisco. Hola, hola. Pasang is the Greetings, everyone. Just for the interpretation purposes, English will be on channel 1, French on channel 3, and Spanish on channel 5. Español estaría en el canal 5, Francés in 3, English in 1. Great. All right. How's everyone doing? Thank you, Jessica. How's everyone doing? It is now 12:30 midday. It's been cold. Everyone get up, please. I do this at every session. Everyone stand up and stretch. Stretch. Wiggle it out. Okay, I want to make sure everyone is wide awake. As we know, everyone can sit down. Squish yourself down into your seat. Pueden tomar asiento. Okay, interpreters, are you ready? Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. As you know, Today is Human Rights Day, and we've organized a day-long session on reimagining conservation and human rights. The issues around human rights are critically important to the success of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And as we started our day this morning, we really set the stage for how we need to respond and act, but also how we need to rethink how we're working on the issues of the integration of conservation and human rights. And we set the stage, we talked about how to integrate it, but in this session, we're going to talk about practice and reality. And I think that's really important for us to think about as we are meandering through the halls here, as we are thinking about the language that is happening, as we think about how we not only need language in the preamble, but in the operationalization of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and then actually how we all need to respond on the ground. So this session is sort of in two parts, and it's really looking at that practice and reality. We have some Indigenous leaders with us today who are going to talk about the work of their organizations and the challenges they have and the challenges they face, but also some of the positive pieces as well that they're moving forward. So I'd first like to welcome Pasang Sherpa from CIPRED in Nepal. Pasang is an Indigenous woman, an activist. She's been a huge leader in terms of climate, and also a huge leader in her country. So Pasang, I would really like to hear about your experience from Nepal with the issue around human rights and conservation in Nepal. And what are some of the challenges you have, but what are also some of the opportunities you see?
Yeah, thank you, Christine, and Tashdile, namaskar, good afternoon, everyone. This is my great pleasure to be in this panel among our distinguished speakers on the International Human Day. And happy International Human Day to all of us here in CBD COP15. Human rights, I was hearing earlier panels, you know, like it was impressive, at the same time also a bit scary also, like how the human rights issues, especially in line with the land tenure issues, no, in the still in a perplexed mode of whether inclusion or outside. So the decision here in the COP or any kind of COP or whether UNCCC or even in the CBD, the decision has to be taken very, very carefully because the implication is on the ground. And you know, every decision, every action at the global level, it has a triple impacts on the ground. So, that is one of the reasons why a human rights approach has to be in the center of the discussion of the conservation here in CBD. Let me go back to my own experience on the ground. In Asia, the situation of human rights is still critical, and this is not exceptional in the case of my country, where I'm from, it's Nepal. So especially like most of the conservation and national park issues is more governed from the federal laws. So federal laws has very critical in terms of recognition of a customary governance system, our customary land tenures, especially our cultural values and practices. That was the basis for intact of the conservation, natural resources, ecosystem. But that kind of connection of the role and contribution of customary governance and the intact of the forest and biodiversity has still need to be filled up. You know, and that to be filled up is possible only when we have a human rights approach as become a basis for conservation model. But the problem we have, the existing modalities that has been continued as business as model for generation already is still continued. And where there's a very small portion of the space for human rights-based approach, because of this one, the customary governance system, our customary institution, our cultural values and practices is a weakening day by day. And the threat is how it's been continued by our next generation. And because of its replication on the ground is continue torturing, threatening, brutalizing, displacing. This kind of stories has been common on the ground in the name of the full solution of the conservation. So that is why I really urge here, that every effort you have done has a really implication on the ground, and human rights-based approach and right-based conservation modalities should be the basis for the post-biodiversity framework decision here in the COP. And just give you the few examples how we have, this is the implication. Recently, even in now, like one of the examples, even in the plain regions where the national parks. In Nepal, we have a national park, and we have conservation, we have a hunting reserve, and also the buffer zone. So the study shows that every month, 3 people die out of the human-wildlife conflicts, and more than 68 cases, more than 60 people are dying in the human rights conflicts in the past 3 years. More than 125 cases. So this just a recent example is one Tharu ladies who has been victim from the conflict of this wildlife conflict, and there was a huge protest. And instead of giving compensation, there was a more suppression, and that brought more injuries and even death of another young Tharu women. So this is just the example of many that, in the name of the conservation, this kind of torture, brutalization, and also even the sacrifice of the indigenous people on the ground continues. That is why we really need right-based conservation models, and human rights basis should be the basis for the conservation. And this will not only help to protect our customary governance, our knowledge system, our cultural values, but also maintain the harmony, peace for all of us to live healthy and happy, and to be transferred by our next generation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Pasang. I think you raised some good points. So one, the traditional conservation model doesn't work, and it's not supporting human rights in the way it should. I think the issues around legislation that recognize customary practice and tenure rights. And I think you said that the decisions that are made at a global level impact what happens on the ground. So, and that there is ongoing threats. There's conflict between communities and protected areas, but also the larger issue of human-wildlife conflict, especially women, as you highlighted. So now I want to go to Francisco Caquilpan, who is Mapuche from Chile, and understand a little bit about the situation of the Mapuche in Chile, the relationship with protected areas, and also talk a little bit about the Mapuche, because you are Mapuche in Chile, but the Mapuche are across 2 countries, as we understand. So Francisco, give us a little bit about your experience and your perspectives on human rights and conservation.
Mari, Pulamien, Pupeñi, Pubenei, Anepalo, Fachante de Bachi, Tefachi Ruscamo. Bueno, vengo de Hualmapu, venimos de Hualmapu, andamos 4, hay 2 lamienes, 2 mujeres y 2 peñes, y es la primera vez que estamos acá. Y nos parece importante estar acá porque el tema que hoy día nos convoca y nos convoca a todo el mundo es trascendental. El tema de la biodiversidad y el cambio climático. De eso hemos venido escuchando ya un par de días. Y estamos acá porque venimos a mirar, queremos aprender y queremos conectarnos con lo que está pasando en el resto del mundo con estos temas. Porque como hemos escuchado y nosotros compartimos eso, decimos que efectivamente es un tema de todos. Y como decía nuestra hermana, los mapuches estamos en dos países. Eso no es una decisión nuestra, es una decisión de los estados. Sin embargo, estamos ahí y estamos defendiendo lo que es nuestro. cuando hablamos, digamos, de todo el tema de la conservación, de la biodiversidad, de los derechos humanos, estamos hablando de especies que habitan territorios. Y uno de los que habitamos esos territorios somos los mapuches, pero no somos los únicos. Y esa es la pelea, esa es la lucha que damos nuestros pueblos, porque cada una de las especies se mantenga, porque cada una de las especies cumple una función. Es como nuestro organismo. Nuestros órganos, uno los tiene donde están porque ahí cumplen la función. Si estuvieran en otro lado, dejaríamos de ser humanos. Entonces, de estos temas nosotros venimos conversando, venimos socializando y venimos articulando nuestro trabajo. En Chile los mapuches somos más o menos 2 millones de habitantes. Tenemos aproximadamente 350.000, 400.000 hectáreas. El territorio original que quedó de lo que fue la invasión española eran 10 millones de hectáreas. Desde 1880 a 1930 más o menos perdimos el 95% de la tierra. Hoy día, seguramente muchos de ustedes han escuchado de los conflictos que existen, y es el conflicto por la recuperación y la restitución de nuestro territorio. Entonces, en ese sentido, nosotros hoy día enfrentamos temas con las hidroeléctricas, con las inmobiliarias, con las empresas forestales, con la empresa salmonera, con la empresa minera. O sea, todo el gran capital mundial está en nuestro Gualmapo, en nuestro país. Y ahí puedo contar una experiencia que vivimos en la zona donde yo vengo. Decía que somos 4, pero somos de distintos espacios territoriales. Tenemos distintas organizaciones, distintas experiencias, distintas luchas, pero en particular lo que a uno le atañe es lo que tiene que ver con las hidroeléctricas. En nuestro territorio nos querían haber construido 12 megacentrales gigantes en una región, en una comuna, Panguipulli. Eso está en la región de Los Ríos. Sin embargo, y eso quería haber estado implementado a los años 2012, estamos en 2022 y no pasó. Ahora, no pasó fundamentalmente porque hubo una visión política y hubo una decisión política nuestra como mapuche. Porque lo principal de eso fue defender nuestro ser, lo que somos. Y eso nos llevó a desarrollar una política, nos llevó a implementar una estrategia que nos permitiera salir triunfante de esto. Y eso fue así. Por lo tanto, se dio todo un trabajo que se dio en el terreno, se dio en las comunicaciones, se dio en lo político, se dio a nivel internacional. Las empresas son todas empresas internacionales, Noruega, Italia, España, Suecia, y la lucha también la dimos allá. Ahora, la dimos y la ganamos porque efectivamente es el territorio nuestro, es un territorio donde efectivamente hay mucho lo que vemos en el paisaje, hay mucha agua. Y eso fue un trabajo de 15 años y fue producto de lo que decía, tener claro lo que somos y tener igual la claridad política de que solo no lo íbamos a hacer. Establecimos una política de alianza con los trabajadores, con los estudiantes, con los ambientalistas, con todos quienes vivimos en el territorio. Y yo creo que ahí hay un secreto, y me imagino que los otros pueblos hermanos que están acá también lo han hecho así. O si no lo han hecho, bueno, nosotros siempre decimos la experiencia de nuestros pueblos, de nuestras luchas, la tenemos que conocer, la tenemos que socializar, la tenemos que difundir. Y eso nos tiene acá, y nos tiene contentos por estar acá. Entonces, cuento esto porque a nivel del país, Chile y Gualmapu, creo que ha sido una de las experiencias exitosas que nosotros hemos tenido. Hemos ganado. Hoy día nos enfrentamos a un tema de la crisis climática. A mí me parece, y nos parece a nosotros, que es súper importante lo que acá ocurre. Nosotros estuvimos en la inauguración de este evento. Y nos pareció súper importante que haya tenido una connotación y se haya destacado la presencia de nuestros pueblos hermanos de acá. Creo que eso es valorable, es importante, pero yo creo que hay una tarea, no lo hemos podido decir y lo digo acá. Creo que el contexto que hoy día vivimos, mundial, creo que estos espacios nos deben servir a todos los que recurrimos acá a establecer alianzas de igual a igual, de pueblo a pueblo y de pueblo a Estado, porque como se dijo a la inauguración, hay que tomar medidas serias y drásticas. Y nosotros decimos, bueno, lo serio y drástico y constructivo es que lleguemos a estos espacios a establecer alianzas para establecer una relación de igual a igual, porque los pueblos originarios, hay conciencia, hay trabajo, hay lucha, hay ciencia, y eso lo tenemos que socializar. El conocimiento nuestro es científico, el conocimiento de todos los pueblos originarios es científico, las universidades han hecho un trabajo científico. ¿Y qué es la ciencia para nosotros? La ciencia es poder observar, tener la capacidad de observar. Y nuestros pueblos originarios llevan miles de años observando la naturaleza. Y eso hay que ponerlo hoy día en valor. Para poder enfrentar la situación para adelante, creo que ahí está el secreto. Establecer, porque para nosotros el tema de la biodiversidad y el calentamiento global es un tema eminentemente político. Los recursos es un medio. Y si se toma una decisión política, los recursos se van a poder utilizar bien. Y si no, vamos a seguir hablando de lo mismo en 10, 20 años más.
Thank you, Francisco. I think you highlight some important issues. Again, we consistently hear the issues around land tenure. Francisco, voy a poner tú. We consistently hear the issues around land tenure and the issues of what are coming at indigenous peoples, whether it's extractive industry, whether it's forestry, whether it's road, or whether it's overall development, but also how indigenous peoples are organizing to respond in partnership with others against these threats, and how they need both a political strategy, a technical strategy, and a financial strategy to be able to move those forward. And I think it's important what Francisco has highlighted on these efforts and the Chilean and the Mapuche context. I want to go now to Paine Mako from Tanzania, who is with UCRT. And I want to hear a little bit about your organization and how you're working in Tanzania, but also hear about the challenges that you all confront in the work you're doing with your communities and in the context of conservation.
It's on. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Christine, for the introduction. My name is Paine. I come from Tanzania. Thank you, my sister from Asia. Thank you, my brother from Latin America, for sharing your stories. And if I was to speak in my mother tongue, my first language, maybe I will do what I'm supposed to present to you justice. But I hope using my third language will still convey the message. Just before I talk about my organization and the work we do, I am a Maasai from Tanzania. I know Maasais are popular around the world, but known to come from Kenya. But we are many also coming from Tanzania. So the Maasai, during the colonial times, lived in the Serengeti National Park. I think most of you are aware of the Serengeti National Park. But the colonial government had negotiations with the Maasai traditional elders to move from the Serengeti to create the now Serengeti National Park, which the Maasai elders agreed. The contract and the agreement was in English, so they didn't know what they were signing to. However, they understood that they were moving out to make way for the Serengeti National Park. And then they moved and settled elsewhere. But from then, they kept moving, and they kept losing land over time. So we work with the Maasai, but also with the hunter-gatherers communities whose livelihood are communal in nature, similar to the Maasai. So the hunter-gatherers also, in a similar way, over the years, lost 80% of their land from moving out of their land to let land replenish or to get back to its natural state so that they can come back and continue reconnecting with the land. So moving that way, they've lost 80% of their land as hunter-gatherers from Tanzania. So that is the history behind the establishment or the beginning of my organization, which I work with. Ujamaa Community Resource Team came into being to be able to address that challenge, loss of land, to be able to secure land for communal communities or collective titles for these communities. That's how we began. It was tricky in the beginning because we never knew there were provisions in the Constitution to secure collective titles. And so we were testing the Constitution, the provisions in the Constitution to provide collective titles for pastoralists and hunter-gatherers communities. So we were in a struggle with our government to understand the meaning of communal or collective titles for hunter-gatherers and pastoralists. And it took us 10 years to be able to secure the first ever collective title for hunter-gatherers communities. But from then, it was easy to scale up and secure more and more titles, collective titles, for hunter-gatherers and local communities. And to date, we've been able to secure over 1.4 million hectares of land for hunter-gatherers and local communities. And this is significant for them because it means they have secure livelihoods. It means they are able to adapt to climate change because their livelihood styles can continue. They are able to move in and out and come back to the land and still find it secure. So that is the beginning of Ujamaa Community Resource Team and what we do. Recently, the government has been able to gazette another protection layer of the land, gazette over 900,000 hectares of the secured 1.4 million hectares of communal titles. And I think we are all familiar with how the process goes in terms of securing tenure, but basically it's about conflict resolution. That takes, depends on the nature of the conflict. It can take years, some take weeks, some take months. So it really depends on the nature of conflicts, but that is the first step, to resolve conflict between communities and communities, and then defining the boundaries of the village in which then a certificate of village land is issued for the particular village. And then the communities are able to document their traditional land uses into an official document that is approved by the government. But on top of that, because their collective, the communal land is seen as open and empty, it's very critical to secure a specific title that secures that collective or open land to continue to stay open. And this is not just for local communities, for pastoralists or hunter-gatherers. It's also for the wildlife to be able to roam in and out of community land, for the communities to coexist and to continue to relate with their wildlife as they have done in the past. That is the reason and the idea behind that, to promote community conservation and to continue. That is the ideology. Community conservation should live and should continue. As much as I can say we are celebrating for those achievements, there are challenges. We are crying at the same time because the same communities in other places have not been able to enjoy those secure communal land rights. They are suffering because of the natural resources that exist within their borders, that conflicting interest. Investors have stake on it, the government have stake on it, and communities have stake on it, and all these interests are conflicting. And so it brings about very conflicting interests that the more powerful suppresses the less powerful. And that is the reality of what we are living now, the situation in Tanzania, that evictions are happening, oppression, harassment, intimidation, and that is what is going on, and it's painful to talk about it in detail. It's very emotional, so I won't go to the details of it. But as we promote conservation, we need to be aware and we need to ask ourselves, why, for what reason are we promoting conservation? at whose expense? Communities are suffering, not because they are violating conservation interests, but because they have protected, they have preserved, and their land is rich, which is being fought for. You know, everyone wants to take a piece of that piece of land. So we need to be aware, and we need to all understand the power we have as big, conservation organizations, and what influences we have in our governments and the situations that are ongoing on the ground, and how we can influence some of these situations to change, because we are all working for the same, for the same interest. We want to promote biodiversity. Communities want to promote biodiversity. But then we need to get into the bottom of issues. Is conservation in actual sense being taken care of on the ground level? Or are those that are actually promoting conservation, what is their situation and what is it they are going through, and how can we help? How can we be there to support their efforts?
Thanks, Paine. I think you made some really good points. I think, again, the loss of land that indigenous people have had over millennia, but also the progress that your organization has made. First and foremost, understanding what's available in the legislation that you have to deal with, and how you've moved that. But as you're having progress, there's still lots of setbacks with respect to what is happening with communities. So before we transition to the next part of our panel, I wanted to ask you, all three of you, one question. This whole day is about reimagining conservation and human rights. What are the one or 2 points or recommendations would you have to everyone sitting here in the room and to those who are sitting in the negotiations right now? What has to be rethought? What's the fundamental change? So give me 1 or 2 short answers, and then we'll head to our next part of our panel. So I'll pass it to Pasang.
I think, as I said earlier also, one of the bottom line for the success of the conservation is, recognition the true actor's role. Because in most of the conservation and national park and even different reserves or buffer zone, the true actors, the indigenous people who have been contributing for intact of the forest and biodiversity, and their role and contribution has never been on surface. In the name of conservation, in the name of national park, all this regulation, top-down approach, that has hardly had a space for the true actors' role and contribution. And especially that contribution is, so in ties with the customary governance and institution. And that has never been acknowledged, that has never been recognized, that has never been promoted, even acknowledged, even like becomes a means of the discussion in the name of the conservation. So I really urge that the real actors, the safeguarders, the role and contribution be acknowledged, recognized. And that would be justice. It will bring a justice for indigenous people to continue these practices. And in the absence of that, it will just bring a false solution. And false solution because it just remains on the paper, but the continuation of the conflict and torturing, and also, it's a continuation, especially for the continuation of the traditional livelihoods and knowledge and knowledge system and cultural values. And that is the bottom line for the intact of the forest conservation and biodiversity.
Thanks, Pasang. Francisco, what are the 1 or 2 points or recommendations that you would put out there for everyone here?
Es difícil poder construir una idea, pero de acuerdo a la experiencia, de acuerdo a la historia, de acuerdo a la cultura, en el contexto actual, uno podría decir de que los distintos pueblos han desarrollado muchas ideas. Igual ha habido una explotación de pueblos. Entonces, por eso decían antes, yo creo que nosotros lo que hoy día debemos hacer los seres humanos es reconocernos en lo que somos, valorar lo que somos y relacionarnos para poder seguir viviendo permitir que la vida siga existiendo. Porque en definitiva el tema de lo que hoy día vivimos es el responsable del ser humano. Entonces creo que ahí hay un tema que hay que profundizar, hay que trabajar. Y lo otro, creo que el tema de la conservación lo hacemos todos. Y dentro de eso estamos los seres humanos. Pero lo hacen los insectos, lo hacen los árboles, lo hacen los animales, lo hacen nuestros espíritus. De esa manera, en la medida en que conozcamos eso, en la medida en que respetemos eso, en la medida en que valoremos eso, efectivamente vamos a estar haciendo conservación, de verdad. Y va a ser posible mantener la vida y que la vida siga prevaleciendo para el resto de las generaciones. Y si no miramos eso, si no valoramos eso, estos encuentros y los miles que se pueden hacer, de nada van a valer.
Thanks, Francisco. I think you made a really good point, recognizing who we all are. And I think, as Pasang said, recognizing who the actors on the ground, but also that collective action that we all need to do. But all the beings do conservation, and I think that's an important piece that we need to continue to recognize. Paine, I'll leave the last points to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think the points my sister and my brother have raised are very critical, and I think I would emphasize the same, recognizing the power we have in different positions, in different levels, and how we use this power to support the oppressed, to support the right thing. But again, to recognize the efforts the local people, indigenous peoples put on their lands and the resources, and how we scale up these efforts instead of working against them or instead of coming up with something new. I think it's less laborious, less expensive when we make use of local efforts, local knowledge to scale up what we need to survive in the next decade. Again, our united voices are critical. Coming together to support each other when issues are critical is what will help us cross the line. It's what will help us to survive. Thank you.
Thank you, Paine. And I think you've made that point, the united voices together working. So I'm going to ask all of you to step down. Our stage isn't that big, and I'm going to ask my second set of panelists to come up and join us here. Thank you very much. Come on up, everybody. You can order yourselves. Oh, you all, no one wants to sit too close to me, I guess. So we heard from Francisco and Pasang and Paine about their experience as indigenous peoples and the struggles and challenges they have. And now we're flipping the coin a little bit. And we have Sushil Raj, who is with WCS, but is also indigenous, working for WCS, the Wildlife Conservation Society. So I think the question I have for you is, what is the reality and practice with conservation organizations on the ground? What are the challenges? What have been the pitfalls? And what are your thoughts about it and how to think about it?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Namaste, Tashidelek. Just a small correction. I'm not indigenous, but I'm from Dalit community in India, which is very adjacent to many indigenous and Adivasi communities in terms of life, livelihoods, dispossession, historically. I think first and foremost, I'd like to share that as a point of analysis and reference, I work with the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, which is a UN Special Rapporteur mechanism. And we released a report on environmental racism and justice. So I think racism and discrimination have to be fundamental points of analysis from where to begin. The root cause of exclusion, the root cause of discrimination, dispossession, lies in racism, in conscious bias, in unconscious bias. So I think that's a very important point. I joined WCS because I came from the human rights movement, and I saw maximum potential for collective impact. Sister Pai highlighted the importance of being united, and I think this is a time we need to really be united together. So what does this mean in practice for us from the Wildlife Conservation Society? My role as the Executive Director of Rights and Communities is to scale our rights-based approaches in conservation, to drive strategies for change where we're not doing well and recognize that that needs to change, and then to promote inclusive conservation through a human rights-based approach to conservation. So fundamental to that really is grounding it in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, analysis of racism, discrimination, looking at international human rights standards, which also address other local communities, and essentially moving forward in different practical ways. We are working with 205 Indigenous peoples organizations and more than 1,500 communities around the world. So what does this mean in practice when we're talking about riverine communities, peasant communities, people of African descent, indigenous peoples across different ecosystems? So in Bolivia, that means helping indigenous communities at their request and invitation to secure title to 1.5 million hectares of indigenous lands. We've talked about securing indigenous titles. In Colombia, we have supported Afro-descendants through their customary institutions. This is very, very important, to gain legal recognition for their own protected areas. So Jing Corpuz mentioned not all protected areas are from the viewpoint of exclusion. They're actually indigenous-led protected areas, Afro-descendant-led protected areas, so it's important to look at that. Fiji, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, we've been working on locally managed community plans, again, at their invitation. So there are two dimensions. One is where we're supporting indigenous-led, local community-led, and that is based at their invitation, application of free prior informed consent. And then there are other aspects where we're doing co-management, co-design, and that's where free prior informed consent becomes even more important. So we've learned quite a few things actually in the course of this work. First is the disconnect between the global aspirations and standards and the realities on the ground. So the success of any intervention or any conservation action requires collective engagement. So again, what does it mean to really apply free prior informed consent in practice? It's at many different stages. Sometimes it's really leaving the space for those discussions within the communities to come back and say, no, not at all, we don't want to start this. At other times, it's accompanying at different steps of the way. It's also very, very important to identify local champions who have high social capital. If there are disputes within the community or disputes vis-a-vis the state authority or with a conservation sector organization, who is it that will be the champion who has the broad-based support of the community that can work across different sectors and different parties? It's also about looking at being very clear about what the expected benefits are when it comes to conservation, to biodiversity protection, such as clearly articulated, realistic, equitable goals, and what does it mean to manage? I think there's often misunderstandings. Sometimes in good faith, people are trying to do things and there are misunderstandings, and oftentimes in bad faith, and that's where the lack of trust comes, where there have been past legacies of harm that really need to be addressed. So for us, we've learned many, many things. I think one important factor which everyone's highlighted is legal recognition. There's a big disconnect in some places where there is no recognition of collective lands and titles. There are places where we have worked where there are armed groups, active military operations going on, which have put communities and indigenous communities in the line of fire. It's very, very important to talk to all stakeholders, no matter how difficult that is. We've also looked at how resources are being channeled. Sometimes there are no resources going to where they need it most. So I think these are some of the elements. There are larger issues that others have spoken to, and I'd be happy to elaborate further. Thanks.
Thanks, Sushil. So I think you made some really good points. I think the issues around racism and discrimination, I think the diversity of communities that organizations are working with and the unique situations there's in, the invitation to work, and the alignment of goals. I think so I'll just take those a couple of points for now. So I want to go to Melinda McLeod, who's with the BHP Foundation, and tell us a little bit about your work, but also where these elements intersect and what you're trying to do to respond to them as well.
Thanks, Kristen. Hi, all. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all meeting and their elders of the past, the present, and emerging. And I'd also like to pay special recognition to all Indigenous peoples that are here today. And thank you to you for your continued championship and stewardship of our lands. I work with the BHP Foundation, and I look after a program called Environmental Resilience. And our idea is to support Indigenous-led conservation. So we know that traditional models of conservation haven't worked. So we also know the importance, the significance, 80% of the best biodiversity is on Indigenous peoples' lands. The most enduring outcomes come on those lands, stewarded by Indigenous peoples. But Indigenous peoples make up less than 7% of the world's population. So we need to flip this model, and we need to take this rights-based approach. So a rights-based approach is, it's going to be complex, and that's where we need all of the enabling factors. It is absolutely tenuous. It is not established as the way to do it, particularly within recognised systems. But it is absolutely achievable. I have messages of hope. I have come here with some of our amazing partners from around the world. We work with First Nations in Canada, where they are supporting 9 million hectares worth of their lands to be culturally led. And shout out to the Mississippi Cree Nation. I'm here with Awahun Indigenous peoples from Peru, and around here somewhere is Edward and Uciela, so say hi to them. I'm here with Lolita from the Pacific Islands, where we work on increasing resilience. We're taking a culture-first approach. So by supporting people in their own aspirations on their lands, what can be achieved? Now, one of the things that I said is that this is complex and it's also tenuous. So what we need to do is set up for sustainability. And when we think about supporting our partners for sustainability, we think about not just the long-term financial sustainability of what they're going to do, but also what is the social and cultural sustainability. How can their culture be supported? What is society doing to wrap around and enable that their culture to be primary in how they're carrying out their conservation practices on their own lands? We also think about strong local organisations, so setting up for strong governance, representative decision making, transparent benefit sharing. And then when we think of sort of the 4 elements of sustainability, we also think about the political. So what are the political factors that need to be in place? And this is all of the stuff that so many of you are working on. So it's about land tenure, rights. It can be large pieces of legislation about recognising conservation as a land tool, as actually a practice. It can be just small p policy, the way that things are being implemented. And so thinking about how to support the advocacy, the lobbying for changing all of those components so that that's in place for the long term. And one example that I wanted to give, so we heard Jennifer in the session before mentioning that in Australia, the Indigenous protected areas are actually working. They are recognised. So Indigenous protected areas are a voluntary statement of conservation on Indigenous peoples' territorially recognised lands. Those people are then empowered and also somewhat financially supported to be carrying out the land management practices on their lands. I say somewhat supported. It's enabled funds to flow from government to support those ranger programs and land management, but it's not enough. So it's supplemented by philanthropic funds and other sorts of enterprise and fundraising. So in Australia, what that has meant is that for the National Reserve System in Australia, now more than 50% of that is coming from Indigenous protected areas. So that's the importance that a rights-based, Indigenous-led conservation approach is having in one country in the world.
Thanks. So I think it's important that you highlighted the issues of culturally led, and I want to also bring out the issues around sustainability. It's not just the investment, it's the long-term and accompaniment as communities need those issues. So I want to turn now to Barbara Lassen, who's with IIED, and I think talking about a little bit about the issues around governance and the tools that can come around governance. So Barbara?
Thank you, Kirsten. And thank you, colleagues, and especially thank you, the three panelists before, for sharing your stories, for bringing these stories here. As you mentioned, Kirsten, I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle. So when we look at the famous 30 by 30 targets that we're all concerned and worried about at the moment, a key piece of this will be the recognition of indigenous territories, of customary lands and waters, of communities, and IIFB is working to get that language in, and fingers crossed. And then there's going to be the rest, which is your protected areas and your OECMs, the one that already exists, and the ones that most probably will still be created in the course of that target. And so one of the things that IIED is working on is a tool that enables actors in these protected and conserved areas to assess equity, to assess governance. So to look at how are we doing in terms of equity and governance. Why did we develop this tool is that, I mean, there's a couple of realities. One is that in state-run protected areas or in co-managed areas, often there will be some form of participation, but sometimes it can be quite token, it can be cosmetic, it can be not the most transparent and equitable and countable, not as much as one would want. And there's a lot of improvements that can actually be done on the ground by having these conservation between actors and shifting that needle. The other reality is, and what we're finding with some of these assessments, is that even in places that are called community-based resource management, that are called community conserved area, and I'm also looking at the colleague from Tanzania who knows this reality, sometimes when you then look under the hood of those areas, you notice that the decision-making, so the power, still resides either with governments or with private actors or with large NGOs, and that actually communities themselves may be involved in the management, but are not necessarily really involved in the governance, which is who takes the decisions and how and according to which systems. So we developed this tool, which is called Site Level Assessment of Governance and Equity, SAGE. And basically, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to give you an idea, the kind of questions we ask in those, or that the actors ask themselves rather, in these assessments is along the question of rights, the question of recognition and of respect for rights, also mutual respect between the actors, respect of knowledge, I think this was mentioned before as well. Everything around procedural rights, equity, how are decision taking, is there transparency, is there access to justice, are there effective dispute resolution mechanisms, so really sort of the details of does it mean to have equitable governance. And then of course also the question of distribution. who is bearing the costs of human-wildlife conflict, who is receiving the benefits of conservation in that area. And so the process is basically, you know, it's a very simple process where there's a prep phase where the actors who carry the process, and ideally this would be local actors. This is not an instrument that's designed for somebody to carry into the area. It's an instrument that's designed to be taken on by a local organization, a local group, to run in their areas with the other stakeholders. So you do a prep phase, but then the main thing is that people meet for 2 days. They separate out in actor groups so that they can have the real conversations more comfortably first within the actor groups. And there's a series of questions around these governance criteria. They assess those. They come back together and they look at the differences. And that's where you see, right? That's where you see that maybe your park authority will say, sure, participation, score 3, it's all, you know, going super well. And then you look at maybe what the women out of the community said, and you see that the score is completely different. And then you try and have conversations around why that difference in perception, and of course ideas for action. And then there's a third phase that you can use for planning. So just in a nutshell, and anyone who's interested, obviously happy to have more conversation around that. But I mean, what I want to acknowledge, obviously, is that this is not necessarily a tool that you can easily use in a place where you have active human rights violations, people being evicted, people being killed, where the conflict is at that level. Obviously, you might need something very different in terms of addressing those violations, reconciliation, reparations, etc. But it is a tool that you can use to surface really what is happening inside these areas and how can we do better. So the idea is really to improve site by site these realities, and hopefully also avoid some of the more egregious issues in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Barbara. So just to maybe wrap up the ending, I'm going to ask you all a question, and the same question I asked our other colleagues. You've all highlighted critical issues, from justice and equity to racism to supporting culturally led, to the issues of governance and having those conversations. So what is it that it seems like we have lots of toolkits and lots of experiences, but what is the fundamental change? What do we have to do with our imagination to really be able to push this forward? So Sushila, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. I think first and foremost, it is a state process. Even here we see we may have all these ideas, but then we have to sit in the room and watch states negotiate. Because ultimately, wherever we're working, there is this state jurisdiction, whether in some places they recognize indigenous rights and lands and territories, in other places they don't. So that engagement with the state is very, very important. Be that a political engagement, a trust-building process with them, holding them accountable, and there are different mechanisms for that. Secondly is the trust that needs to be built with the communities whose rights have been violated. There's been historical harm, lots of legacy built onto racism, colonialism, many dimensions. And it is, we always have to remember that we are coming from the outside, even if we ourselves may be coming from certain communities when we're operating elsewhere. So we need to be conscious and sensitive of that, be respectful, try to spend time understanding culture, building relationships, coming at it at good faith and equal partnerships. I think someone highlighted the equality of things is very, very important. Equality and non-discrimination, because we are coming in with certain biases and certain power dynamics. So I think that is a very, very essential element. And once we start building that trust, then we can start building common vision. We have to work together. We cannot work in opposition. We cannot work in polarized ways. So that common vision and collective goal. And there are many practical tools, but if these dimensions are not addressed, we can come up with the best tools, the best methodologies. It's not going to work. Thank you.
Thanks, Sushil. Melinda.
Thank you. And Kristen, thank you for putting this session together to reimagine it, because we do have to reimagine it. I really liked hearing from Helen in the session before of learning that it's not just the targets, that it has to be all in the monitoring. And yet, 0 of the Aichi targets were met. So everything that we've been doing is not working. We have to reimagine something different. And so if I could borrow a practice from some of my Indigenous friends, let's reimagine, let's take ourselves 7 generations in the future. What is that world like that we want to create? And then step backwards. Maybe what were the factors that got us there to that new future that absolutely we can create, but we have to start right now because we need to do more, and we have to start now because time's running out.
Thanks. Barbara?
Okay, if I'm going to be completely honest about this question, I'm going to go completely off-piste, but something that the Mapuche colleague from Chile said earlier is we are one of the species who do conservation. We are one of the species. As long as we don't get that, as long as we still think that somehow somebody gave us the right to make decisions for all of the living world, as long as we don't lose that arrogance, as long as we don't listen to the people who tell us there's other ways of looking at this, there's other values that enable us to do what we call conservation in partnership, not only amongst ourselves, but in partnership with all those other living beings, we're still going to be in trouble. We're not going to make it. And so, you know, I think that's one thing, and a subset of that is conservation organizations who go to what they call the field with the best intentions, absolutely, but still coming at it with, I'm going to talk to beneficiaries, I'm going to talk to recipients of support. That also is not going to work. And as long as we don't learn to sit and listen and see people as partners, and for crying out loud, we're going on the lands of people. You know, I mean, sometimes it boggles my mind, but honestly, I really think it's a question of attitude more than anything. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. So trust, looking ahead to the future, what is the future we want? We are not the only species, the human beings that are here, and we need to think about that. So I'm going to leave it here. I want to thank our panelists, all 6 of our panelists. So give a round of applause. We have a 15-minute break now, and we're going to have a session that's looking at the issues of environmental defenders. We're going to continue this conversation. But again, those of you who are here in the room, turn to the person next to you, have this conversation. Have the conversation about what you're doing, what we're working on, and how to create that transformation. Thank you, everybody.